Hey guys, so I did my research project on the 1964 race riots between the Malay and Chinese groups in Singapore and in Malaysia, and the political and racial tensions that led up to it ultimately. So my essay mainly focuses on the racial tensions between the Chinese and Malay and how that contention led to Singapore's expulsion from the Federation of Malaysia in 1965, where it became first fully independent as a country. And so, looking back at the history of the region reveals a really deep political past for both Chinese and Malay groups. And the two main political parties that I focus on are the United Malays National Organization, the UMNO, and the People's Action Party, the PAP. And and the United Malays National Organization was founded in 1946, which came about in response mainly to the Malayan Union instituted by the British after World War II. The Malay wanted to represent their own culture and status on, state and national levels, and so, they created the UMNO, and they had some sway with the British rulers, though not a lot. And it wasn't really until the 50s that they started focusing more on politics and governance. And the People's Action Party was formed in 1954 in large part by political activist and co founder Lee Kuan Yew, and has been the governing power in Singapore since 1959. Hasn't changed ever since. And the People's Action Party aimed to ultimately create a multi ethnic society, whereas the UMNO were mainly focusing their efforts on improving Malay culture and Malay uh, cultural dominance, basically, of the nation. The PAP wanted to make a multi ethnic society and set up a more democratic socialist government. Um, the push for political representation by both parties in the early 60s brought past racial tensions to the surface for both the Chinese and Malay and culminated basically in the July race riots of 1964. And these were actually repeated just a couple months later in September, although not so much due to the political agitation seen in the first ones. Um, the cause of the actual riots that happened are highly contested, with each side blaming the other, for the first punch, basically. Um, but one thing that the riots did, um, uh, following the couple months, year after the riots happened, um, it was basically the cause for expulsion of Singapore from the Federation of Malaysia, which happened in 1965. And this was actually directly in response to the fears associated by the race riots in 64. And basically, they feared that Singapore and, the racial groups in these areas may erupt again in more racial violence. And so that's why they expelled Singapore from the Federation of Malaysia. And so this left Singapore with nearly two-thirds of its population being of Chinese descent. And it left Malaysia with a majority of Malays. And then there was about a 10% population of Indians still there, and a 35% or so Chinese population. So not as much, definitely more Malay dominated. Um, and yeah, and that's pretty much what I go through. I do in my essay go through a little bit further about what happens just in Singapore, just with their government and their first government, basically led by actually Lee Kuan Yew. He was their first prime minister. Um, and yeah, thanks, guys. Have a good one.